event of this first night of festival Liburnicon. It is my great pleasure and privilege to announce our guest of honor, Monte Cook, game designer and writer. A man who needs no introduction, as I can see. Nonetheless, I'm going just to briefly say that a person responsible for many good things that have happened to board gaming community, including the best and the third edition of Dungeons and Dragons, as well as many games like Arcana Evolved, Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil, Numenera, and so on, and also an author of two novels, The Glass Prison, which is a novel set in Forgotten Realms setting, and of Aged Angels, which is not set in Forgotten Realms setting. It's a book about conspiracies in the paranormal. And also author of a book, Skeptic's Guide to Conspiracies, which is an interesting topic and would fit also in this festival as well, but this time we are talking about board games. The title of today's talk is Into the Depths of the Earth, the Dungeons of Dungeons and Dragons. Our format is more or less 45 minutes, but we are quite flexible about that. And of course, we'll have book signing if someone has his or her player's handbook, DM's guide, or something like that wants to have it signed. We'll have a book signing after that here, and hopefully some beers at the bar downstairs. So without further ado, Monte, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you to Liburnicon for bringing me to the other side of the planet. I've not been to Croatia before, so this is wonderful. We're taking advantage of touring around and really enjoying it. Today, when I heard that the theme for Liburnicon this year was going to be beneath the surface, and they asked me, what do you want to talk about? Well, it seemed really obvious to me. The most obvious thing being, the dungeons of Dungeons and Dragons. And it made me think, and it made me think, why Dungeons and Dragons, right? Why those things? And it all, let me see. There we go. It all goes back to 1974, which is when Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, two game designers, game fans in the central part of the United States, got together and they worked apart, but they also worked together, and they wanted to create this game. And really, they didn't realize it at the time, but they were creating a whole new kind of game, right? It wasn't just a war game, it wasn't just a board game, but a whole new kind of game. And that's, we could do a whole talk about that, about how exciting and interesting that is, that, how many times has someone made a new kind of game? Not very many. But anyway, they had to think of something. What were they going to call it? And the story goes that Gary talked to his daughter, who was very young at the time, and gave her a bunch of ideas of what to call it, and she was the one who chose Dungeons and Dragons. And to me, these are the original books, and to me, no one would ask, well, why dragons? Right? Dragons are obvious. Dragons are cool. Dragons are, they say fantasy immediately. They imply sort of majesty and power. But you have to remember, back in 1974, while people talk about dungeons now, they do that because of Dungeons and Dragons. In 1974, dungeons were just the place at the bottom of the castle where you threw the prisoner, and it was just a hole in the ground. I wanted to kind of get into why these kind of classic adventures of going down into a dungeon, got a torch and you got your armor and all that stuff. Why is that so important to gaming, and why is it still so important? So that's what I wanted to talk about tonight. And like I said, there's historical dungeons. I'm sorry, this is what I wanted it to be. This is a classic dungeon. But why? Why are dungeons so classic? And like I said, a real dungeon is a hole in the ground, and not very interesting at all. But actual Dungeons and Dragons dungeons are these fantastic, interesting places. And they're filled with all these magical wonders and monsters and treasures. And so I thought we would, descend down into the dungeon here and talk about why dungeons. And first and foremost, I'm going to say, it's because they're fun. But there's reasons for why they're fun. And there may be things that we haven't always thought about. It just sort of happened that this was the way that the game was designed to be played. And one of those reasons is because I really think that this is like the key to why it's so important. And that's because dungeons are easy. They're not just fun. They're if anybody can sit down, become a dungeon master, and make a dungeon. They're really kind of like you fill in the blank, right? It's just what's in this room. Well, there's going to be a monster. What's in this room? Well, there's going to be a trap. And it's really easy. It's like you're filling in a quiz or something with a bunch of blank spaces, and you're just filling it in with interesting ideas. And anybody can do that. And the other reason why they are so easy is because they are very easily controlled. If any of you have run a game, a role-playing game, you've probably run into the situation where you thought that you were going to go you thought the group was going to go in one direction, and instead they just went in a completely different direction, and you weren't prepared, and you didn't know what was going to happen. Well, in a dungeon, you've got a lot more control, right? Basically, you can go, left or right. You can go through the door, or you can, go down the stairs. There are these interesting choices, and a good DM is always going to make those choices interesting, and it's going to make the choices important, because maybe there's treasure down at the bottom of the stairs, but there's a horrible trap on the other side of the door. But it's easy, right? There aren't a million choices. There's just the 2 or the 3, right? And so dungeons become this really easy way, particularly for starting players, to kind of understand the situation, understand the flow, whether they're the game master or the player. It's easy to, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit in tomorrow's talk too, but I like to think of something called the shared imaginary space. And that is when you're all sitting around a table playing in a role-playing game, everyone has what's going on in their head. And the more that a game master can make what's going on in your head the same as what's going on in their head and someone else's head all at the same time, the better the game is going to be, because everyone will understand and they'll all see the same picture in their head. Well, dungeons make that easy because, first of all, they're pretty simple, but second of all, there aren't, like I said, a million different choices. There's just a couple, and so it's like a flow chart in that way. If you're familiar with using a flow chart in school or whatever, where you've got basically you follow a path. Sometimes that path will branch. Sometimes it will end in some important thing, and that's just like a dungeon, right? But instead of paths, there are corridors, and instead of the spots on the flow chart, there are rooms, and so that it's really easy to understand and follow the flow of the path that the players choose. The other cool thing is that dungeons will create a story almost by themselves. We talk a lot in role-playing games about creating a story, creating a fantasy story. You want to be J.R.R. Tolkien, but you're not. Dungeons will make their own story, right? First we went here, we found a cool treasure, then we went there, and there was a dragon, and so the story arises kind of on its own. And there are things built into the nature of dungeons that we kind of take for granted, but lead to the creation of the story. Like, dungeons almost always get harder the deeper you go, the farther you go, right? Just like in a story, the complications and the tension always increases as the story goes on. The dungeon itself is built in the same way that an author builds a story. And that you go and it gets harder and harder, and then finally you come to the big climax, and maybe that's where the big demon lord is, or whatever, that is sort of at the heart of the dungeon. So it's inherently a story. There's another interesting aspect to dungeons, and that is they help us create a clear demarcation, a clear line for where it's relatively safe and where it's very dangerous, right? You're standing outside the gate to the dungeon, and you know that you're probably pretty safe, right? You're outside. Maybe there might be a monster or something, depending on the campaign that you're playing in. But you know that as soon as you go down those steps, as soon as you go through that gate, things are going to get more dangerous. And so that narratively creates this really interesting place where it tells the players, okay, here we can rest now because we got out of the dungeon and it's probably safe. Now, and then mean dungeon masters will turn that on their head and use that, against them and make the most dangerous thing be waiting for you outside the dungeon once you come back out. But still, you're playing on that idea that we all sort of understand, which is here it's safe, down there it's dangerous. And I want to talk a little bit more about how game masters, how dungeon masters can use dungeons to enhance their own, creativity as they're creating and playing the game. And one of the great things about dungeons in that way is that, every dungeon room, and I'm oversimplifying here, but every dungeon room is its own special, unique thing. And so that means that once the players get to the door in the dungeon, right? They're exploring, they get to a door, and they know that they're going to open that door. Anything could be behind that door. It could be, the most bizarre, strange creature that they've ever seen. It could be the most wondrous treasure. It might be an empty room. It literally is opening up the door to any possibility. And that creates a really good space for role-playing games, right? Because it's these points in the course of the game when you're playing in the session where things are about to get more interesting. And so, you probably, have seen it in your own games where, maybe everybody gets up and gets a drink or gets a snack or whatever, but there are these points where no one is going to do that because everybody knows, something is about to happen. It's going to be interesting. And dungeons create that in this really simple way. And that's really important for the sort of the psychology and the flow of role-playing games. And of course, you add a little bit of magic, and and a dungeon together, and suddenly you've got anything, right? There's sort of no limit. You know, you want the other side of that door to be a portal to another dimension. Great, that's fine, right? You want that to be, you know, a whole chamber where the gravity is reversed and you walk around on the ceiling and you know, there are creatures in there that you know, float around upside down or whatever. There's nothing in the game that will tell you no, you can't do that, right? The game master, whatever idea he or she comes up with, you can create whatever you want. And the reason that that's really interesting to me as a game designer is because I see a lot of people who get very intimidated by, you know, when you say, why don't you try running a game? Why don't you try being a game master or a dungeon master? And they'll say, well, you know, I have to create a whole world. You know, I have to, you know, fill this whole map with nations and cities and cultures, and I have to do all this work. And again, you know, none of us is J.R.R. Tolkien, and we shouldn't take that responsibility upon ourselves like that. And so that's what's cool about dungeons, is that you can reduce the sort of creative process down to the dungeon room, or just like a single encounter. And I think that's really important because, you know, when you're sitting around a table with your friends and you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, yeah, maybe the GM has a big, fantastic setting and there's all this politics and everything, but what really matters to you at the table most of the time is what's the encounter that's going on right now, right? You know, are we, you know, talking to these merchants? Are we fighting these goblins, right? What's going on right now? And dungeons make that really simple because everything is reduced down to that encounter. And it's almost like, you know, and again, I'm oversimplifying, of course, but you go to a dungeon, you go into the room, you deal with whatever is in there, and then you go down the hallway, you go to the next room, and it's sort of like the game resets, and now you get to do another cool, interesting thing. And the game master can design these sort of interesting encounters, which is what people are going to really remember. I mean, when you talk about a game that you played years ago, you probably don't talk about, you know, the geopolitical antagonism between these two fantasy nations that happened in the campaign. No, you probably talk about that time that your friend, you know, ran into the Medusa and wasn't expecting it and got turned to stone, and, you know, it's on the encounter level that really create those memories that we all really love. And so the other cool thing, or another cool thing about dungeons is that they really cater to the idea, which is core to D&D, of a diverse group, right? In a dungeon, you need a fighter or two, but you also need a wizard because there's going to be magical stuff to deal with, and of course you need a thief because, you know, there's going to be traps and someone's going to have to sneak ahead. And you need a cleric because the fighter's going to get beat up. And, you know, everyone has a role to play in a dungeon. There is no one who, you know, has to kind of sit that session out while they're in the dungeon because they don't have anything to do. There's always something to do for everyone. So anyone can, you know, you can create whatever kind of crazy character you want, and it will work in a dungeon, and you will feel useful. You will feel powerful. I also wanted to talk a little bit about a real love of mine, which is dungeon maps. I love dungeon maps. I think that they are sort of their own art form, really. And I'm such a nerd about them that I will just look at dungeon maps and admire them, and think about how the person who designed it knew that there's that if you're here you could go down these stairs, but you can also go somewhere else, and there's other ways around, and if they're being chased they might have to go a number of different ways, and I find that really interesting and fun. And the other cool thing is that even though I think they can be these beautiful works of art, it's also something that anybody can make a dungeon, right? All you need is maybe a piece of graph paper and a pencil, and you can fill it with all kinds of rooms and hallways and whatever. And and I think that's a beautiful piece of art too. I love the asymmetry that you get when you make a dungeon, but there's also kind of a flow to it that is really neat. And so you can have these kind of hand-drawn maps. You can have digital maps. Somebody creates on their computer, and that's also really cool. And they have a very different look, but it's much cleaner and nicer and more precise. And dungeons can be very simple, just kind of some doors and a few rooms, or they can be very complex. And basically as they as fits the needs of the campaign. And so I think that's really interesting. You can even take that concept of the dungeon and you can apply it to your science fiction games, right? And you can explore what is actually a spaceship, but you do it just like if you were playing a fantasy game and you're exploring a dungeon. And you kind of use all the things that I've been talking about, but you can use them in a fantasy setting. You can do that in any, you can have a modern day dungeon crawl where you're going through a huge office building. You can, post-apocalyptic, like Last of Us or something. That's kind of all about dungeon crawling, because you're going through these old ruins and finding weird things and treasures and whatnot. And then, let's see if this is, yeah. So the other thing that I love about dungeons is how they kind of affect things in the game narratively, right? The story of the game. And I talked a little bit about that already, but there is, when you get away from the rules and, the sort of the minutia, there's this idea that you're going into this really old and almost mythic place. In fact, sometimes this concept is referred to as the mythic underworld, right? You are going down into some space below the surface that is totally unlike anything that you might find on the surface. And you're going down into the unknown, right? Dungeons are really kind of a way to, put the unknown into a campaign so that it can be known. And in a very sort of basic way, that's what adventurers going into a dungeon is really all about, right? It's about going into a place where there's mystery and solving that mystery, even if the mystery is, where's the treasure? It is that sort of interesting kind of story that can be told so well with a dungeon. The other thing that's interesting is that, and again, this kind of goes back to what I was talking about, how when you're standing at the entrance of the dungeon, you understand the difference between the surface and the dungeon. Well, it's also the difference between sort of the alien and the understandable, right? That, you go and you're walking around on the surface in your D&D game, and there's a village and maybe a merchant caravan and whatnot, and we kind of all sort of understand that. But as soon as you go down into the dungeon, things are going to get strange, and we love that, right? That's what makes the game fun and interesting. And so it's alien, but it's not like mind blowing, alien, where it is off-putting, right? We can still understand it, right? We can still understand that it's a hallway, and it's the floor is flat, and we can understand this space, even though it is actually quite alien. And in a dungeon, again, this has to do with the you go from room to room, and there could be anything behind the doors. So the world around you is changing all the time. And it's never going to get boring, right? If the game master has created a dungeon where there's all these interesting encounters throughout the dungeon, then you're never gonna zone out, right? You're never gonna start checking your phone or whatever, because who knows what you're going to encounter next? Who knows what's at the end of that hallway, right? And you're not going to know until you go find out. And it incorporates and challenges all of your senses, right? Dungeons offer you something interesting to look at. If you're a smart player, you're going to stop and pause and see if you hear anything that's coming your way, or that might provide you a clue. Sometimes there's smells that are not nice smells, but you are you're really engaged on all the different levels. Now, I mentioned that the dungeon is kind of like an entrance into the mythic underworld, and so it conjures up sort of the things. I should have used this slide earlier. This is exploring further into the dungeon. I just really like that image. I like it because the dungeon is so big and the characters are so small. It makes you feel intimidated just looking at it. But what I was going to get at was, there are some classic dungeon examples in our myths, right? There's the labyrinth with a minotaur in it, right? That goes all the way back, right? And so that idea of exploring this sort of cramped, maybe underground space with monsters in it really kind of is deep within our culture. And now today, they've become a ubiquitous part of lots of parts of our culture, right? Like I said at the beginning, right? Now, dungeon is something that we talk about. If you play video games, you know what a dungeon is, right? Even if you've never cracked open a D&D book, you know what a dungeon is. And so, they've really become very pervasive in our whole culture. And it speaks to that part of us inside of us that wants to, go down and find something that no one has seen before, or at least not for a very long time, right? We want to know what's down there and what's waiting for us, and we want to find what it is, even if ultimately it's maybe something that we really don't want to find, or causes some real challenge in our lives, or our characters' lives. It's just exciting. It's interesting. It's a way for game masters to exercise their creativity in maybe a way that isn't possible without them. And so that's why I think it's called Dungeons and Dragons, and has been since 1974. So I am here with time left. We can answer some questions. It can be about dungeons, but feel free to ask anything. I've been a role-playing game designer for more than 30 years, and so if you've got any questions about that, or making games, or anything you want, and I will let you manage the questions for me. Thank you so much.
ready? 3, 4. Okay, just keep your hands up. So I'm going to write them down. Just a second. I don't know the names. So
I'm gonna sit now, I think.
Okay. Okay, I see. Okay, so we'll start with the yellow shirt. Okay, I see you also, but we'll start with the yellow shirt.
How did you become a game designer?
Well, so I basically I was running a lot of games. I started playing Dungeons and Dragons when I was 11 years old, and so I played all through school and into university. And a friend of mine at university, unbeknownst to me, went to a game company and said, "There's this guy. He's at the time I was playing a game." It's probably too old for any of you to remember, but it was called Rollmaster. And I was playing that game. He went to the people who made the Rollmaster, and he said, "You got to talk to this guy." And so, really, I credit a lot of my career to my friend Steve, who kind of went and pitched for me like that. But basically, I talked to them, and I was still in university, and I wrote. They basically told me the kind of book that they were interested in, and at that time it was a book called Creatures and Treasures, and it had in it creatures and treasures, and so I wrote that book for them, and they liked it, and so I got to pitch them some more ideas, and eventually I went to work for them full-time and moved to their office. And from there, I went to work for TSR, who is the company that made Dungeons and Dragons, and so I'm sorry, my answer is always really long. But as a sort of a side story, I didn't want to work for TSR, but I wanted to go there to just see it. Right, because I loved Dungeons and Dragons, and I wanted to know this is where Gary Gygax wrote, and I wanted to just see all of that. But I had heard all these terrible horror stories about working there, and about how they were cruel to their employees, and forced people to work on manual typewriters and whatnot. And of course, none of that was true. It was really a fun place, and so when they offered me the job, I took it, and then. And then, of course, you probably know that Wizards of the Coast then bought Dungeons and Dragons, bought everything that TSR had, and so I moved with them and worked on 3rd edition D&D, and now I'm with my own company. So it's been a progression, but it started all thanks to my friend Steve.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So next question here.
I am a big fan of dungeon delving, but I started with the 5th edition of D&D, and I get the impression that newer players aren't such great fans of dungeon crawling and digging deeper. They more so like staying on the overworld, doing narrative encounters and so on. So my question is, as a game master, how can I help players like these fall in love with dungeon crawling?
I think that, this sounds really maybe too simple, but, kind of entice, you know your players better than anybody. And so you know what motivates them, whether it's treasure or secrets or whatever. I think that just sort of dangling what they want in front of them, but now telling them, but it's actually way down deep, right? And maybe it's deeper than you're actually even telling them, so they have to go really deep. I think that I have found in my experience that even people who don't have a lot of experience exploring dungeons, or who think that they don't like it, it's like a light goes off, and they recognize, this is actually really fun, for a lot of the reasons that we talked about today. There's just so much inherent story there, right? Here's the other thing too. I'm going to throw out one more thing. I didn't talk about this very much, but when the players are exploring the dungeon, the players actually have a lot of the power, simply because they're the ones getting to decide where they go. Right, it's as though you're presenting them this entire area and saying, okay, you can go wherever you want. And I think that really appeals to a lot of players. That okay, I'm in charge now. I'm not going on some quest for some NPC where I have to do what he's telling me to do. I can go wherever I want.
That's great. So our next question, Bruno, I think. Yes.
Yep. Thank you. So since you showed us S1 Tongue of Horrors, what is your favorite classic dungeon?
Oh, my favorite classic. I really like an old adventure called The Vault of the Drow. And the reason that I liked it was because while it still, is exploring underground places and whatnot like we're already used to, it was the first dungeon that I ever encountered where you didn't have to kill everything. You could make some allies and then use those allies against your enemies and play enemies off of each other, and you can kind of get into the kind of the politics and whatnot of a realm that is still completely alien to us because it's all underground and filled with glowing fungus and dark elves.
That's so great. Okay, our next two questions, because they're sitting one next to the other, are two gentlemen in blue shirts. First dark blue and then light blue.
Have you any tips for new dungeon masters?
I definitely do. In fact, if you're around tomorrow, that one of the things I'll be talking about a lot is tips for dungeon masters and players. But real briefly, I would say that a lot of people worry a lot about knowing all the rules and making sure that you have memorized the rule book and everything. That actually isn't important to a beginning dungeon master. If you get some rules wrong or whatever, who cares, right? The most important thing that new dungeon masters should remember is to make sure that everyone's having a good time, that everyone's being heard. If you see somebody at the end of the table and they haven't said anything for a while, maybe kind of say, hey, what do you want to do? What's your character doing right now? And making sure everyone's included, making sure that people are getting to make interesting choices is another really big thing that sometimes new game masters forget. Because, really, like the whole essence of a role-playing game can kind of be reduced down to dungeon master says, here's what you see, what do you do? Player says what they do, right? And then it just goes back and forth and back. It's a conversation, right? And if, as we all know, if you're in a conversation but the other person isn't really listening to you, right, or isn't paying attention to what you're saying, it becomes a very boring conversation pretty quickly. And so, making sure that you're listening to the players, you're hearing what they have to say, and it matters, I think, is some of that. That's some of the most important stuff.
Thank you.
Okay, so my question goes on the other end, and it has to do with the writer's block or the dungeon master's block. Well, as we're speaking before about making things simpler, about keeping choices limited, it reminded me of staring at the blank page when I tried to write something. I mean, in the form of fiction, which oftentimes is really scary, and the blank page is the white abyss. And then I go to playing, and first playing is really easy way of making the story, to be a player in somebody else's game. when you're running as a dungeon master, something that you already have an idea, but just engaging with the players, that's also something that moves me forward. But then comes the time when, okay, I need to make something for my players. I need to keep the story going, keep the story further, and I just feel, okay, blank. Next thing in the page. So.
You know, I'm going to answer similarly to how I did to another question, which is, if you're running the game, for your friends or your family or whoever, you know what they're interested in. You know, because you know them, right? They're your friends. And I think when in doubt, give them something that you know that they'll like, right? To use a very oversimple example, right? If you've got a player and you know that they really like elves, I don't know, I'm just making something up here. If so when in doubt, start there, right? And focus on that, so that you know that you're creating something that's going to be of interest to them. And then, do something, unexpected, or maybe do something unexpected. Worry about the unexpected part later, right? And just kind of give them what they expect, and then throw the twist in. But I think that the players are the greatest inspiration that a dungeon master can have, because if you're playing in the middle of a game and one of your players says, oh, I know what's going on here, I bet, right? And they give their own theory, and it's something that you hadn't thought of at all. You can either, say, well, forget what I had planned, that's cooler, I'm going to use that. Or, take that idea, save it for later, and so they're feeding you ideas, and they're going to like them because it was their idea.
That's great. That's great. I'm using it all the time. Okay, well, we have so many questions, but that's great because we have so much time. So you go first. That's right.
Hi. My question is more wider. I'll try to condense it. Regarding what you were saying, how Dungeons and Dragons started off, I always also perceived that because of the background, how it came to be, which is from tabletop wargaming, that it's sort of needed to go in this direction of dungeons, sort of also to control the players, to control the narrative, to actually keep them in line so they wouldn't be disruptive for the game. And consequently, the game needed to be really strict on the rules and really strict on the world around. So would you agree that the games such as the Cypher system, which are really freeform and very loose in the rules and the setting and everything, they wouldn't even be possible at a time like that? Do you think that the community has evolved, grown up, matured over the years from back then to what it is today?
I think I definitely agree with that. I think that Dungeons & Dragons, we're still talking about Dungeons & Dragons in 2013 because it's Dungeons & Dragons and the elements that went into it. And, and there are other things too. The fact that Dungeons & Dragons was level-based, right? So that you're always, increasing in power, I think, is a huge factor. And I think that because it's got classes, right? So you sit down at the table and you know your role, right? I'm the fighter, I'm going to do fighter things. I think these are all things that sometimes get criticized about Dungeons & Dragons, but we wouldn't be talking about role-playing games at all, I think, if Dungeons & Dragons hadn't started exactly the way it did, with the same format that it has. So yeah, I definitely agree.
So I have a more specific question. Like, really,
trivial, but I always wondered that because you were like one of the head designers of third edition, and I know that you used the Taurus campaign for that you tried out all the ideas because you basically started it like in second edition and evolved to third, if I'm not mistaken.
Sort of, yeah.
Sort of. Why are not characters from Taurus iconics? I mean, everyone likes like Mealy or I don't know, Tordek, but they were much cooler.
Yes, the adventures that I showed there were the characters that I had.
I read your blog way back.
Cool.
Because I'm old as fuck.
So they weren't made into the third edition iconic characters. I think for many reasons. I didn't really necessarily want them to be because remember we were still playing those characters at this time, and I didn't want that to influence the game that we were playing. But also, so like most D&D campaigns, the characters developed weirdly, and got some weird magic item or some weird special power or whatever. I mean, we all know what that's like in a D&D game, and that makes them interesting, but it makes them not iconic, right? Like those characters.
I mean, like that brother sorcerer, he became almost a villain towards the end of the campaign.
He did, yes. Yeah. Well, that's long. That's a long.
I remember there were two brothers, duelist and.
Yes, Circean and Sarai. Yeah, they were. The fun thing about them, and now I'm going to start telling gaming stories. So I ran two campaigns, but they were set in the same city at the same time, and I played twice a week, and so one player who still works at Wizards of the Coast now, his name is Chris Perkins. He played in both. And he played twin brothers.
I thought they were your characters, sorry.
No, and they one was named Circe and one was named Sarai, and they were twin brothers, and one was in one group and the other was in the other group. And the thing that nobody knew except for Chris and me was that sometimes they switch. They were twins, yeah. But yeah, so they were very atypical, and the reason that the iconics were created was so that you could create, now I'm not even remembering all their names, but like Ember the monk was just sort of the most basic monk that you could have to show people what a monk was supposed to be like, and then we assumed that you'd deviate from that, so they were just the baseline.
Great, thank you. So next, the person sitting next to Vaka.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the lecture. It was very informative. Do you think I could get your opinion on OSR? And if you think it is a proper medium to introduce younger players such as myself to D&D, the way it's supposed to be played, I'd say.
I suppose that depends on what you mean by how it's supposed to be played. I am a fan of OSR, or old school Renaissance games, and I think it's because they harken back to a lot of the things that we were talking about tonight, with sort of those, getting the game back to its roots of 1974 D&D, but maybe with more modern sensibilities in some ways. And I think it's a very good way to introduce new players, because it is, I think OSR gaming can be less intimidating in some ways, because there isn't, there isn't as much sort of broad world building creation often in OSR games. But it's more based on the encounter and that level of gaming. And the only thing that about sort of most OSR games is that they're often very deadly, and it is difficult for newer players who are used to playing maybe video games, computer games, to transition to something like an OSR game where they don't have an infinite number of saved games and a whole bunch of different, they're very fragile and they might just die. And so that's kind of a different sensibility. And that's just going to be some people's preference, and some people are going to hate it. And it just kind of depends on the person.
No, I understand that completely. I lost a magic user 5 times before I leveled it to level 2.
that sounds, and the thing is that, people who play a lot of OSR games and are old like me, that's the way that they remember playing it back in the 70s or 80s or whatever. But that wasn't the only way that the games were played back then, because I didn't play that way, and so in that way the OSR doesn't speak to me, because that isn't the way I played the games. I was much more sort of, I wanted to be J.R.R. Tolkien. I was creating crazy stories and drawing cosmic characters out of Marvel comics and doing all kinds of things like that. That was much more story based than most OSR games. So when people talk about old school gaming, it actually, I think, means a lot of different things to different people.
Okay, next question here.
In your career as a game designer, do you have any concrete regrets, and what is your biggest one?
I have an answer. So I was at a game convention in the United States, and someone else in the game industry came up to me, and he said, oh, I've got this new game, and it is the most amazing thing. It's going to totally change gaming forever, and I'm going to show you this game, and then you're going to want to invest all your money in this project that I have. And I had heard this kind of thing before, right? And so he showed me his game, and it was nice, it was all right, and I kind of politely said, I won't invest. I think I'll refrain. But good luck. And that person was a fellow by the name of Peter Atkinson, and he went on to become the president of Wizards of the Coast, because the game that he was showing me was Magic the Gathering. And I once did the math. And if I had invested even a small amount of money, I would be a millionaire today. That's my biggest regret. I didn't believe him when he said it was going to change the game industry, because it did.
So, our next 3 questions come from that part first. The person in the gray shirt.
I have a really good new game that's going to change.
Let me get my wallet.
As a game designer and as a designer and writer of adventures not for private use but for commercial use, do you plan them for your private table and then tweak them to be more appreciated for more people's taste? Or do you plan to make, okay, I have a good idea for the story, I'm going to make the adventure and then write the whole thing out, and then do you have some bullet points that you go through?
It's mostly the first. And I mean, here's the thing that's true for me. I've been playing role-playing games for by far the majority of my life. And that was true when I was 11, and it's true today. I love role-playing games, and I'm running games all the time, which means that when it comes time to produce an adventure or a new product, it's very easy for me to turn to the things that I've already run for my own players and said, oh, well, I'm gonna make that into an adventure, and I'm gonna make that into a product, and so like I think a lot of game designers talk about play testing, but for me, I say pre-playing. I play them first without any thought to how it'll be in a commercial product, and then take those ideas, those adventures, those characters, and make them into a product. And I think that the reason that works so well for me is because when I'm running a game, I'm catering to the players. I'm encountering problems, maybe in the rules or in the story or whatever, and I'm thinking, oh, here's a way to change it, right? Like I've made up a lot of new spells, for example, and each one of those was to solve some kind of problem that had come up in a game that I wanted to see solved. I'll be thinking, oh, that NPC should be able to do that, right? And so I'll make that spell, and then it'll go into a product. And I know that somebody out there is going to find that useful because I did. And so that's basically the way I work.
Did you? Great. I have a short follow-up.
Follow-up, yes, okay.
Did you ever have a private game that went basically good and then published it and nobody cared about it? Or maybe you were disappointed about how it was received in public or something?
The answer is probably. I can't think of a good example of that, but I'm sure if given some time, I could probably come up with something.
Okay, next question. Person sitting in the left hand row side is part of the right of the shoe. I'm not seeing the other part of the Okay, so it's you, yeah.
So my question is, when you joined TSR back in the 90s, the second edition was at its peak, and from at least my perspective, that was maybe not the peak of TSR, but production-wise, it was its biggest output. How did it feel to be part of that creative unit or process?
Oh yeah. So you're right that when I joined TSR, they were producing so many different products. Every month there was sometimes 4 or 5 new products, and so many different game settings and worlds, and so that was exciting. And because of that, TSR was very encouraging of people to just constantly be coming up with new ideas and whatnot, and that's a really fun environment to work in. And there were a lot of people employed as both professional designers and editors, and so there was this whole big group of us that were constantly, bouncing ideas off of each other, and we all worked in little cubicles, and we would wander into other people's cubicles and say, hey, I have an idea for this, or oh, I saw that thing that you were writing about here, maybe you could do it this way. And then we would play with the toys that they had in their cubicle, because everyone had a whole bunch of toys in their cubicle, because it was that kind of place. I have really, I don't want to go too deep into this. I have really mixed feelings with how sort of corporate culture and creative work, how they blend, because sometimes it's not so good. But you get a bunch of creative, fun people together and have them work together every day. It's going to create a really fun environment. And so I have nothing but good memories of those days.
A small follow-up, maybe?
Yes.
Is there a world setting that you wish you worked on and you didn't have the chance back in the day?
Oh, that's a good question. I never really got a chance to work on Spelljammer, and I always thought that seemed really interesting. When Planescape came out, I was so blown away by it that I did everything in my power to get to work on that, and it worked. I mean, I begged and pleaded and bribed and did everything I could, and it worked. So that was the really big one for me in terms of the settings, especially from the 90s. Yeah.
Player guide was great.
Thank you.
Great, we have 3-4 more questions. So next person sitting in front of the person that asked last. So.
Okay, so where are the studios that the games were made, and is it possible to kind of visit them and kind of see the process and culture that is in the studios?
Obviously, Wizards of the Coast is the biggest one, and you can, they're in Seattle, Washington, or just outside of Seattle, Washington, in the United States, and you can go there. They do tours, I think. They certainly used to, and you can kind of see where the magic happens.
Great. Next question, person in bright blue t-shirt.
So, I want to know if is there some setting that you're like a fan of, or is there I don't know, not Numenera. I know you work on Numenera, but in the Dungeons and Dragons, is that something that you're a fan of more than others, and you think that most games should be played or something like that?
Well, I think most games should be played in the settings that I worked on. I don't necessarily think that most games should be set there, but I am a big fan of Eberron. I thought that was really great, and I'm good friends with the designer, and I think he's really a wonderful designer and a wonderful fellow, so I'm a big fan of his. I also kind of like just because of nostalgia, I like the setting of Greyhawk, and that's where a lot of my early adventures were. I mean, that I played. That's where I set them, and even just the names of the places means they ring true for me because of that nostalgia. Because I was playing there when I was 11, 12 years old.
So great. Okay, next question.
All right, so I have a question related to the survivalist aspects of dungeon. Basically, when I run games, I always make sure, I count rations, I write down how many torches people have, all sorts of stupid shit people never like. My question is, should I be doing these things? Because I feel like reading old adventures. It seems like there's a lot of emphasis on time management and all these things, and I don't feel like that really connects to a lot of people. So I just wanted to put you in.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that that those things don't connect with people very well. There are some people. I mean, there are whole separate games that are completely based on that. Like there's a game called Torchbearer that is all about how long your torch is going to last, and you've run out of rations and that kind of stuff, and you can play D&D that way. And I think you're right. I think that some groups in those early days did do that, and the designers kind of catered to that. But in my experience is like you. Most of the players that I have tried to enforce that with have not enjoyed it, and ultimately it's a game and it's supposed to be fun, so I became a lot more lenient.
Excellent. We have one more question. Just a brief follow-up or played just like a 2-session game. We never played like this. We never micromanaged the equipment. But at that time, actually, the main quest was like surviving in the darkness, which you have just like a dragon appeared in front of the dungeon we explored, so we are not allowed to exit the same way we entered. And now it becomes a problem, like, I have 4 torches, how many torches do you have? And we need to like find a way out, and we really scarce on resources. So, but yeah, I definitely don't think that it's going to play that way all the time.
I have a strange story that's like that. I ran a game where I was starting a brand new game, and we were in, I think it was in college, and we were in someone's dorm room, and we were getting ready to play D&D, and I said, okay, we're playing something totally different. And the dorm room got transported to hell, and the players all played themselves, and they only had what was in the dorm room to deal with. And so, like the guy's roommate had a hockey stick in there, and so that was like their main weapon. And they were using textbooks and throwing them at monsters. And the funniest part of that story to me is that this was just a one-time, one-shot thing. And so I did that, and then we went back to our regular campaign. But the next time we met, my friend Jim showed up for the game just in case I tried that again. And he was wearing this big trench coat with a bunch of pockets. And he had like knives and food and all these different things and all these tools. And he's just like, okay, I'm ready. He could barely move. He had this coat full of so much equipment.
Great. Okay, next question. Yeah, it's you.
So I was wondering, while you were DMing or playing a campaign, did you ever catch the DM, or did you ever have a moment where the players caught you off guard and you had no idea what to do? And when you found out what to do,
every time. all the time. In fact, I've gotten to the point where I love that. That's where I'm happiest, is when I have to come up with something right off the top of my head that answers a question that someone has that I had never thought of, or decides to go somewhere that I had never predicted, and it really keeps me on my toes. And I think it's interesting because game masters sort of ask that of players all the time, right? Players aren't prepared. They don't know what's going to be behind the door. They don't know what they're going to have to deal with, and so they're constantly improvising their reactions to brand new things. And so I think it's really fun when those tables are turned and the game master has to be the one who has to react to something that he wasn't expecting. And so I love that. It used to bother me when I was much younger because I would, no, you're supposed to go this way. But now I just love it.